Violence doesn't always arrive with warning. Sometimes it creeps through a town, unchallenged, feeding off silence until someone refuses to stay quiet. They saw an easy target. A black woman, new to the neighborhood, raising a son alone. When they stormed her home, taking what they pleased, smashing what they didn't, they expected fear and compliance. But they didn't know she was a Navy SEAL, trained to dismantle threats and conditioned to survive. The mistake they made wasn't just underestimating her. It was thinking they were in control. By the time the dust settled, the gang would be broken, their leaders would fall, and they would learn what is meant to mess with a mother with everything to lose if she failed. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The moving truck rumbled to a stop in front of a modest single-story house, its tires crunching against the gravel driveway. The air was thick with southern humidity, the heat rolling in waves over the quiet suburban street. Zariah Kaylani stepped out first, her dark, unshaken eyes sweeping across the neighborhood like a soldier surveying new territory. She wasn't paranoid, just prepared. Azael, her 18-year-old son, climbed out after her, his slim frame carrying the kind of tension that belonged to someone far older. He hesitated before reaching for a box in the truck bed, stealing glances at the houses lined up along the cul-de-sac. The neighborhood was pristine. Manicured lawns, symmetrical homes painted in warm, neutral colors, and porches adorned with rocking chairs that had likely never known an unfamiliar visitor. But beneath that perfect exterior, there was something else, something unwelcome. The silence told her everything. No warm greetings, no curious neighbors offering help with the move. Just the cold weight of eyes on their backs. Across the street, an older man leaned against the railing of his porch, a cigarette hanging loose from the corner of his thin lips. His expression wasn't openly hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. A few houses down, a middle-aged couple stood by their mailbox, whispering to each other while they cast quick, judgmental glances in Zariah's direction. It wasn't unfamiliar. She had encountered it before, stationed overseas, walking through villages where the locals saw her as an outsider, a disruption to their routine. Except this wasn't a foreign war zone. This was supposed to be home. Azael shifted uncomfortably, lowering his gaze to the ground as he stacked the boxes by the door. He wasn't naive. He had grown up understanding that some places weren't meant for people like them. Zariah had chosen this town for its quiet, its safety. But now, standing here with the weight of unseen stares pressing down on her shoulders, she wondered if she had made a mistake. Then she saw him. A man, mid-50s, stocky with a gut that suggested a former life of fitness, stepped out of the house next door. His pale blue polo shirt stretched slightly over his stomach, and his stiff khaki pants looked like they hadn't been worn in the sun a day in their life. He wasn't looking at her, yet. Instead, he was focused on the camera system he was mounting to his front porch, adjusting the angle carefully. The red light blinked, indicating it was live. Zariah narrowed her eyes. He turned then, slow and deliberate, as if he wanted her to know he had done it on purpose. The message was clear. "We're watching you." She didn't react, didn't give him the satisfaction of flinching or looking away. She had spent years training under worse conditions, standing firm under the stares of men who wanted to see her break. A man like him wasn't going to rattle her. She grabbed the last box and nudged Azael toward the front door. "Let's get inside," she murmured, her voice calm but carrying an edge. Inside, the house was nothing special, just walls and floors, space meant to be lived in. But to Zariah, it was something more. It was a fresh start, a place to breathe again. The scent of new paint lingered in the air, blending with the warm wood polish of the floors. Sunlight poured in through the large windows in the living room, casting golden slants across the walls. It had potential. Azael stood in the middle of the room, shifting from foot to foot, his hands stuffed deep in his hoodie pockets. "They don't want us here," he muttered, finally saying what they were both thinking. Zariah set the box down and rolled her shoulders, the tension in them a familiar weight. "They don't get a say," she replied, unwrapping a kitchen knife and sliding it into the drawer with a little more force than necessary. Azael hesitated, watching her. He had seen that look before, when she used to come back from deployments, when the world was still something she had to fight against. "You always say that," he murmured, because it was true. That night, after the last box had been unpacked, Zariah sat by the living room window with a cup of tea, staring at the street beyond. The neighborhood was quiet now, almost unnervingly so. Azael had gone to bed, his door shut, music playing softly from the other side. She should have been resting too, but sleep had become something foreign to her long ago. Across the street, the man with the cigarette was still out on his porch, watching, not even trying to hide it. She exhaled slowly and leaned back into the chair, her fingers tightening around the handle of her mug. The morning air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint, lingering aroma of gasoline from a lawnmower down the street. The neighborhood was as pristine as ever. Every house neatly lined with symmetrical flower beds, white fences and mailboxes standing at rigid attention. It looked like the kind of place where nothing ever went wrong, where people left their doors unlocked and waved at their neighbors every morning. But Zariah knew better. She stepped out onto the porch, adjusting the strap of her shoulder bag as she locked the door behind her. Across the yard, the neighbor from 2 houses down, Ellen Caldwell, was already making her way over. Ellen was in her early 50s, the type of woman who dressed like she was always on her way to a church fundraiser. Her blonde hair was meticulously curled, and the cardigan draped over her shoulders looked as though it had been ironed that morning. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile Zariah had seen before, the polite, slightly forced expression of someone trying to appear warm while masking curiosity. "Good morning," Ellen called out, pausing at the edge of the driveway as if testing the waters. Zariah nodded. "Morning." Ellen's gaze flicked to the house before settling on Zariah again. "I meant to come by sooner, but, well, you know how life gets busy. Moving is such a hassle, isn't it?" She glanced at the house again, her expression unreadable. "It's just you and your husband?" Zariah felt the subtle probe beneath the casual question. Ellen wanted to know who they were, how they fit into the neighborhood's carefully curated image. She wanted to place them in a box, determine if they were a threat or simply an unfortunate presence to be tolerated. "No husband," Zariah answered evenly. "Just me and my son." Ellen's smile faltered for half a second. So quick, it could have been missed. "Oh," she said, her voice softening. "That must be difficult." There it was. The pity, the unspoken, how do you manage? The assumption that because there was no man in the house, things must be harder, less stable, more incomplete. Zariah kept her expression neutral. "We manage." Ellen tilted her head slightly, as if assessing her. "Your son? I saw him heading to school yesterday." "Yeah, Azael." A glimmer of something flickered in Ellen's eyes. Concern. Maybe even an attempt at genuine kindness. That's a tough age for boys, especially without a father. Zariah's jaw tightened. She knew it wasn't meant to be an insult, but there was something about the way Ellen said it, something laced with unspoken assumptions. She had heard it before. Boys without fathers, as if the absence of a man in their home somehow meant something was missing. Before Zariah could respond, Ellen's expression brightened again, as if she had just remembered something. "Well, if you ever need anything, we're just a few houses down. It's good to have neighbors you can rely on." Zariah didn't trust that for a second, but she nodded. "Appreciate it." Ellen lingered for a moment before offering one last smile and heading back across the street. As she walked away, Zariah could almost feel the weight of the unspoken words between them. She wasn't sure if Ellen was trying to be kind or just fishing for gossip. Either way, it didn't matter. She had bigger things to worry about. The afternoon heat was suffocating by the time she pulled up in front of the house again. Azael sat slouched in the passenger seat, one earbud in, eyes glued to his phone. His silence wasn't unusual. He had never been the chatty type. But there was a certain weight to it today. "School all right?" Zariah asked, her fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel. Azael shrugged, still looking at his screen. It's fine, fine. She hated that word. It never actually meant anything. She exhaled, shifting the car into park. You know, you don't have to let people walk all over you. That got his attention. His eyes flicked up to her, a shadow of annoyance creeping in. I didn't. She studied his face for a moment. He wasn't telling her something. Azael unbuckled his seatbelt and grabbed his backpack, pushing the door open. Can we just go inside? Zariah sighed, deciding to let it go. For now, she stepped out, adjusting the bag on her shoulder as she moved toward the front door. Something felt off. Her footsteps slowed as they reached the porch. The air was too still. Azael didn't notice. He was already reaching for the door handle when she caught his wrist, stopping him. Mom, what? She held up a finger, silencing him. Then she heard it. Something inside the house. Movement. The faint shuffle of feet. A crash. Laughter. Zariah's pulse slowed, her mind shifting into the kind of focus that had been drilled into her for years. She was trained for moments like this, for the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. She reached into her bag, her fingers closing around the handle of her knife. She had left her firearm locked in the safe, thinking she wouldn't need it in a place like this. She had been wrong. She looked at Azael. His wide eyes mirrored the realization sinking into his chest. Go to the car, she murmured. His breath hitched. But now, for once, he didn't argue. He backed away slowly, his face pale, his fingers gripping the strap of his backpack so tight his knuckles turned white. Zariah exhaled, bracing herself. Then, with steady hands, she pushed the door open. Chaos greeted her. The living room was a wreck. Couch cushions shredded, bookshelves overturned, the coffee table smashed in two. A group of men stood in the middle of it all, laughing as they tossed items to each other like it was some kind of game. One of them, tall, lean, a mess of greasy blonde hair, was holding a framed picture of Azael. He studied it with amusement, before casually tossing it over his shoulder. The glass shattered against the hardwood floor. Zariah felt something cold coil around her spine. The men hadn't noticed her yet. She took a slow step forward, her voice even. Put it back. Silence. 4 heads turned toward her. For a moment, they just stared, like they hadn't expected to get caught. Then the blonde one grinned. Well, look at that. He gestured toward the others. She's home. A shorter, stockier man, shaved head, a long scar running down his jaw, leaned against the broken bookshelf. This your place, sweetheart? His voice was laced with mockery, the words rolling off his tongue slow and deliberate. Zariah ignored him, her eyes flicking between them, assessing. 4 men, none armed, at least not visibly. They weren't professionals, but they were dangerous. She exhaled, letting her fingers flex around the knife handle. Her voice was steady. You can leave, or I can make you. That made them laugh. The blonde one, the apparent ringleader, spread his arms out like he was inviting a fight. I'd love to see you try. Zariah's muscles coiled, the air in the room thick with tension. She had been here before, standing on the edge of violence, waiting for the inevitable. They thought she was weak. They thought she was just another single mother in a house she didn't belong in. They had no idea what was coming. The laughter echoed in her ears, coarse and mocking, the kind that came from men who believed they had nothing to fear, who had spent their whole lives believing in their own invincibility. Zariah stood motionless in the wreckage of her own living room, taking in the destruction around her with a slow, measured breath, the weight of the situation sinking into her muscles like a slow burn. The sharp scent of cigarette smoke mingled with the musty odor of spilled beer, broken wood, and something else. Something metallic and faintly familiar. Blood, maybe. Glass crunched beneath their boots as they stood there, waiting for her to react, waiting for her to break. They weren't worried. They weren't even taking her seriously. That was their first mistake. The blonde one, the one who seemed to be in charge, stepped forward with an arrogance so thick it rolled off of him in waves, his dirty sneakers dragging over the shattered frame of Azael's picture without a second thought. His grin widened as he looked her up and down, his fingers brushing lazily over the handle of a hunting knife at his hip. his posture casual, confident, as if he had already won. "Lady, I think you're confused about how this works," he said, amusement dripping from his tone as he gestured toward the destruction around them, the overturned furniture, the broken shelves, the torn fabric of her couch. Zariah didn't answer, her expression giving away nothing, her body still, her hands loose at her sides, her breathing controlled and even. The blonde one smirked and continued, his voice slow and deliberate, as if he were speaking to a child. "See, this ain't just a house anymore. This here's a message. You and that little boy of yours? You don't belong here." The others chuckled at that, their postures easy, relaxed, their amusement thinly veiling something more dangerous beneath the surface. A second man, stockier, with a long, jagged scar running down his jaw, leaned lazily against the broken bookshelf, tapping a cigarette out of a crumpled pack before lighting it with the kind of slow, practiced indifference that only came with experience. "Ain't nothing personal, sweetheart," he muttered around the cigarette, the words muffled by the roll of smoke between his lips. "Just trying to remind folks that some places ain't meant for everyone." Zariah exhaled slowly, her fingers twitching once before settling. Control, timing, focus. She had been trained for moments like this, trained to assess, to wait, to let her opponent believe he was in control before dismantling him in the most efficient way possible. There was no need to rush, no need to lash out without precision. If she had learned anything in the years of war zones and conflict, it was that the most dangerous predator was the one that knew how to be patient. The blonde one, still smirking, took another step forward. She moved fast. In one fluid motion, Zariah reached out, her fingers clamping around his wrist in an iron grip, twisting sharply with practiced precision until she felt the satisfying pop of tendons straining beneath his skin. His cocky smirk barely had time to vanish before a choked grunt escaped his lips, his entire body lurching forward as his knife clattered uselessly to the floor. She didn't hesitate. The moment his balance shifted, she drove her knee into his ribs with enough force to send him staggering backward, his breath leaving him in a sharp, strangled wheeze. For the first time, she saw it flicker across his face. Fear. The shift in the air was immediate. The other three lunged into action, their previous amusement snapping into something sharper, something laced with anger and disbelief. They hadn't expected her to fight back, hadn't expected resistance, hadn't even considered the possibility that she would be anything other than an easy target. Scarface moved first, the cigarette falling from his lips as he swung at her with the kind of brute force that suggested he relied more on power than precision. She ducked under the wild strike, her muscles shifting with the motion, and in the same breath, she reached down, grabbing a jagged piece of the shattered picture frame from the floor. Glass sliced cleanly across his cheek as she swung it upward, the sharp edge cutting deep. Blood sprayed across the room in thick droplets, and he let out a howl of rage, clutching his face as he stumbled backward. The stocky one, the brute, was already moving, barreling toward her with the kind of unrelenting force that came from someone used to overpowering their opponents through sheer size and strength. She twisted away, her foot planting against the floorboards as she redirected his momentum, sending him crashing into the side table with a heavy, splintering crack. But they were learning. She barely had time to recover before Scarface came back at her, his movements sloppier now, fueled by anger more than anything else. He caught the edge of her shirt, yanking her backward before she could fully dodge, and the sudden shift in weight sent her off balance. The moment of hesitation was all the stocky one needed. The brass knuckle gleamed just before the hit landed. Pain exploded across her ribs, sharp and immediate, her breath hitching as the impact stole the air from her lungs. She barely had time to register it before another blow came, this one catching her just beneath the jaw, the metallic taste of blood pooling at the back of her throat before she had even hit the floor. Her ears rang, her vision swimming, but she forced herself to move, forced herself to get up. She twisted sharply, her legs sweeping Scarface's feet out from under him, sending him sprawling onto the shattered remains of the coffee table. She could feel the strain in her muscles, the burning ache where the brass knuckle had connected, but she didn't stop. She wouldn't stop. But she was slowing. The blonde one was back on his feet now, his previous arrogance replaced with cold, simmering rage. "You think you're tough?" he spat, wiping the blood from his mouth. "You're just a damn—" She didn't let him finish. Zariah surged forward, her fist colliding with his jaw before he could get another word out, the impact sending him staggering into the bookshelf. The moment of triumph was short-lived. A hand grabbed her from behind, thick fingers wrapping around her throat before she could react, yanking her backward with enough force to send her crashing against the wall. Her skull hit wood, her vision flashing white for a split second before pain bloomed at the base of her neck. Then the blows came. A brutal punch to her stomach that knocked the wind out of her. A kick to her ribs that sent her sprawling to the ground. Another punch, this one to her temple, turning the world into a blur of shadows and pain. She gasped, her body resisting, muscles coiling, but they weren't stopping this time. They were done playing. The blonde one crouched beside her, his fingers digging into her hair as he yanked her head up, forcing her to meet his gaze. His face was bloodied, his expression twisted with rage, his breath coming in short, labored pants. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" he hissed. Zariah's fingers twitched. She needed to move. She needed to get up. Then she heard it. The front door creaked open, the hinges groaning against the weight of movement. The sound cut through the haze of pain, sharp and immediate, pulling her back into focus. The men hesitated, turning toward the entryway, their grip on her loosening slightly. Footsteps. Slow.